Hello, my name is Bob Tickleman. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer, and I want to welcome you to this session of what you want to know when you want to know it. Today, we're going to be taking a look at designing Microsoft Azure infrastructure solutions as part of the AZ-305 designation. We're going to be looking at specifically in this module on governance, and that is your ability to enforce business rules and regulations inside of your technical infrastructure. We've got a number of topics that we'll be covering, and we'll discuss what is governance. We'll then take a look at these things called scopes, and there's a number of them. We'll go down from management groups into Azure subscriptions to the resource groups that hold the resources themselves. We then take a look at a service called tagging as your ability to actually assign these tags to a series of objects that you have for automation purposes or filtering, whether it be for searching for billing constructs or whatever, but tagging is an important part of your resource governance. We'll then take a look at Azure policies. If it exists in Azure, you can control it with a thing called a policy, and that enforces your governance you have for restricting the location which resources can be used, the size and scale of resources you're working with. All of that will be done through the policy. We then take a look at a feature called RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control. Now, this is not brand new, but it's relatively new for maybe some of you. It's our way of assigning permissions and access to resources. Now, RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control, is different than a model of permissions that we used to assign on access control lists with access control entries. RBAC has features that have a role that has a scope of permissions that you have that you could then assign to one of the scopes that I mentioned up in resource groups, subscriptions, or all the way up to the management group. We'll also take a look at a design component for an Azure landing zone. These are Microsoft recommended practices that we get into, and you can use them as a template and modify them to meet your specific needs. So let's get into these topics. When we take a look at governance, it's a business's ability to be able to guarantee the specific outcomes, according to business practices, on your person-to-person interactions, between my system-to-system interactions, and then my people-to-system and system-to-people interactions. We've got a series of documents that cover all of these, and you'll see some of these diagrams over this series. And we break this up into two major areas: resource management and identity management. You'll see in a few minutes that we're going to bring in a concept called scopes, and it's important that we understand that. Now, all of these governance that we're talking about are well documented in two documents that we'll use as the framework throughout this series: the well-architected framework and the cloud adoption framework. And we'll make reference to them, and you'll have links to them to be able to look at this information. When we take a look at this interaction, we want to be able to apply a series of rules that will allow us to predict the outcome of those types of interactions, as I said, from person to person, person to system, system to person, and system to system. We break this up into the two areas because that's how we're going to deliver this material, is focus in on each one of these individual components. Now, scopes are an important part of this because one of the terms that we're going to take a look at is permissions and area of impact. And you'll hear us use this term called RBAC, or the Role-Based Access Control, which is a way for us to grant access to something. The other term is we have scopes, and they fall into this hierarchical structure. The first scope happens at this thing called the tenant level. The tenant becomes your namespace or your starting bucket that you want to put things into within the multi-user or multi-tenanted space of public Azure. It is our recommendation that you start with a single tenant. Now, there are reasons to have multiple tenants, but you want to use that as a fallback when a single tenant won't meet your needs. We'll cover more of this as we get into other areas. The next thing we want to take a look at is the scope of identity management versus resource management. So that becomes the next split. There's a whole set of resource management scopes that we deal with, and there's a whole set of identity management scopes that we deal with. I now want to focus on the left-hand side of the lower screen and take a look at the scopes in a hierarchical structure. Starting at the top, we have our first scope as what's called the tenant root management group. You'll see this in a coming module. We'll talk about management groups specifically. We can have up to 10,000 management groups in a layer structure up to 7 layers deep. That allows us to spread these groups across so I can meet most organizational requirements across that scope area. Now, by default, scopes will inherit certain attributes of a parent object. So a child object in a scope that got something turned on in the parent object would also by default have that turned on in its child scope level. Below our management groups, we get a group of scopes called subscriptions that will inherit things from their parent, which is a management group. So subscriptions exist in management groups. We then get resource groups that are billed to a subscription. So the management groups are an organizational construct. Subscriptions are a billing construct. Resource groups are a resource construct. And then resources exist within the resource group. So understand that. We'll talk about it in each one of these specific areas, but scopes are an important part of your governance structure and design. This is where the course material talks about these very specifically. And we have that tenant root management group, and we hierarchically build these to meet our requirements to easily deploy the policies or the rules that we want to implement into our governance model. We're going to be talking about Azure governance and specifically focusing in on the area of management groups. Let's get into this. When we take a look at governance, it was your ability to enforce a set of business practices and rules to make sure that the expected outcome of the interactions of those resources or people are going to have some kind of predicted outcome from that. And so we're going to take a look now at the specific scopes at the very top of our level that we really get to control of. Now, we're not going to talk about tenants at this level, which we mentioned in a previous module. The tenant, you want to use that as the starting point, but really this is where you get to design your organizational structure. And I don't care if you're a small regional organization or a global 5 organization around the world. I believe that if properly designed, we could fit everybody into a single tenant. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not reasons to have multiple tenants because they become really the sphere of the top scope of your governance model. I have a customer, here in North America, they have a subscription business that people join a club. And in that club, they have a service that requires them for HIPAA regulations, which are health improvement, very similar to the GDPR rules in Europe, that says that they have a mandate that certain personal data needs to be managed at a completely higher level than they wanted to manage their regular subscription level. In that model, they determined that it was easier for them to apply the governance for HIPAA regulations to that specific part of their business. And so while we could have built it into an organizational structure using management group, it was going to be difficult for them to prove HIPAA regulations. And so we created 2 tenants for them. So again, reasons to have multiple tenants, but you want to be able to have something at the tenant root group then apply to the entire organization in that parent-child relationship. So looking at the management groups and some of the considerations you want to take a look at, this is an organizational construct. You can take any company and whether it's geographic. So I've got a group of my companies in Europe. I've got some in Asia. I've got some in North America, South America. Maybe you've got regulations or legal requirements. You can create this structure any way you want. As I said, there's 7 layers, 6 really that are yours. The tenant root group is ours. It's there by default and you can rename it. We then get an organization level that you could then have that maybe you've got multiple divisions if you've got at that level. And then in there, you can have up to other levels, up to 6 in total that you can work with. And so for maybe a retail business, you've got a set of governance rules that apply down that chain. Under your research and development, you might have a different set of rules under that chain that you're dealing with from an organizational perspective. 10,000 management groups that are in 7 layers deep that you can literally map out any organization. And the beautiful thing about that is if there's ever a change, it's very easy to move objects around. You can move a management group from one branch that it's in, as long as it's got no child objects. You can't prune an entire branch, but you can move a management group to another management group. as long as it doesn't have any child objects in it. And it would then inherit the new attributes of its parent object. So a great way to provide some flexibility about your organization. So what we often take a look at from a planning perspective is to take a look at organizations, look at your past as the best predictor of how you're going to behave in the future. Has your company gone through dynamic change? Has it grown through organic growth or has it grown through acquisition? Has it stayed fairly stable? And you can now build an architectural structure using management groups that should be able to withstand a 5 to 7, 8-year period that you're working with. So use that as the challenge. Use it as a starting point to try and build an organizational structure within a single tenant and not defaulting to have tenants for test and development. And I've got a different tenant for every customer or every division of my company. You want to try and see if you can fit this in using management groups at the top level of a scope level in a single tenant. I'm going to be looking at specifically Azure architecture and looking at a component of governance and specifically how Azure subscriptions fit in that governance. Let's get into this. Earlier, we've talked about scopes, and we saw that there's a hierarchical structure that we have, and we started off with a thing called a tenant, which becomes your bucket of resources in Azure that you can allocate at the top level of a scope. Below that scope, we had up to 10,000 management groups across 7 layers that you could organizationally structure to map the building out of your organization from, geographic regions or components of your business. Maybe it's different businesses that are under an umbrella. Subscriptions become a billing construct. You must have at least one subscription, or you can have as many subscriptions as meet your desires. What you need to be able to do is subscriptions are a billing construct that you could then put quotas and limits around to restrict the access to certain resources as well. You can allocate the things called resource providers, and I'll do a demonstration of this at the end, of how you can say this subscription can only be used for these types of resources. In that hierarchical scope, they will inherit some of the policies or the business rules that we're going to implement at the parent level, and they can inherit the way down. Subscriptions belong in a management group. And we talked about they can be 10,000 of them in a 7-layer deep model. As a child object, so if I'm in a child management group that has a parent management group with a subscription in it, I get the benefit of that subscription by default. I'll be doing a demonstration of that at the end of this as well to show you how that inheritance works. But you can actually apply subscriptions at multiple levels. Child objects can inherit the subscription capabilities. So if you have a general billing construct that you need across multiple divisions, you apply it higher up in the scopes, management groups, and it would be inherited and shared across all of those groups. If I have a specific project maybe that I want to build to a specific group, I can create a subscription for that and allocate it to that management group that maintains that business unit for that unique billing construct. Billing is done on a monthly basis. And we have several different methods in which you can bill. There's a thing called an EA or an enterprise agreement. A lot of our corporate customers have that availability. There's a pay-as-you-go subscription. There's free subscriptions. The documentation will talk about what subscriptions are available and what their billing construct is. We're going to be taking a look at Azure governance and focusing in on the specific design area of resource groups. Let's get into this. We've seen that from a governance perspective, we want to be able to apply business rules and easily manage them across a wide variety and ranges of how we organize our business. We started off with a module that talked about at the tenant level. We saw that below a tenant, we had the 2 areas of identity management and resource management. We're focusing on that second one right now, the resource management. Within the resource management side, we saw that at the top level, we had management groups as an organizational structure to map to the business structure that you have. And we saw that we could apply some of these governance. So one part of your business could behave potentially like a different part of your business. Below the management groups, we had subscriptions. And subscriptions become a billing construct. So if I need to have different types of billings, I bring that unit of scope, subscriptions, to provide that flexibility. Now we're looking at resource management, the actual objects that you're going to consume and use inside of Azure. All of those resources are going to then be billed against a subscription. So they will inherit the objects that's their parent. So in this case, a subscription. Any resource in a resource group will inherit the construct of the subscription that it is billed to. You'll see an example of this in a bit when we go into the demonstration. Now, the grouping of resources in a resource group can vary widely. There's a traditional model that maps to some of maybe what you're familiar with on premises. The networking team in your organization manages all the networking resources. The SQL team manages all the SQL servers. You've probably got an OS or VMware team that manages all the VMs that run all this stuff. And so we group resources by the category, regardless of where they are. That's kind of an old model, and yes, we could follow that, but it's not probably where you want to start off. The other thing you want to take a look at is maybe grouping resources by using the thing that share a common life cycle. And that is our recommendation, and you'll see it as the first bullet point. Our recommendation is for objects that get created together, get updated together, get used together, all the way through to destruction, they would probably work best in a common management group so I can manage them collectively. Also, what they then do is they inherit the business rules or the policies that we want to apply to them through this common construct. Now, maybe neither one of those works, and so you can use some combination. There's no one set rule, but I would try and go to one of them as a standard and then use that as the variation off of that. But our recommendation would be create resource groups that have objects that share a common life cycle. I have a small variation of that I'll do in the demonstration in a few minutes when we get to it. But resource groups are a great way to be able to manage these resources through their life cycle and have them fall into the governance model, using that as one of the final scopes in which we can deploy our policies. Now, you can have policies right down to the scope of the actual resources, but we typically don't do that. We do that through the resource group itself. We're going to be taking a look at Azure architecture and looking at the topic of designing for resource tagging. Let's get into it. We've talked through a series of other modules about this thing called scopes. And we saw that at the tenant level, which is the top level within Azure that you have from a scope perspective, you then get a series of management groups that you can use to organizationally replicate how your business runs. We saw that in this diagram, subscriptions being below that to provide a set of scopes. In that subscription, you then have the resource groups that are built to that subscription. So we see this hierarchical structure. Tagging is a great resource for us to be able to identify objects for a variety of reasons. We mentioned that subscriptions are a billing construct. I could have multiple resources in multiple resource groups rolling up into the same subscription. How do I separate them? I could create a set of tags that would identify maybe one project from another based around cost centers. I could have it based around region. So by tagging objects, it is metadata that lives with that object so that if I get one of these roll-up constructs of, say, a subscription, I could then sort that bill by a tag. Now, tags, you can have up to 50 tags on any one object. So any one object can have up to 50 tags. Now, it sounds like quite a lot, but based on around our well-architected framework, we have some recommendations of the kind of tags that you might want to have. And you start taking a look at reserving 5 or 6 tags for geographic region, 5 or 6 tags for the ability to have a billing construct. You can go through those 50 tags fairly quickly. Now, tags are done in a thing called a name-value pair. Any one object, while it can have up to 50 tags, can have only one instance of a tag. So let me give you an example. I have a tag for cost center, and I might have hundreds of values for that name-value pair. The name is cost center. The value is 1001, 1002, whatever the cost centers are. A resource can only have one name-value pair for cost center. I can't have 2 cost centers associated with it. I would need a different name for the second. You might have primary cost center, secondary cost centers. Those are 2 different tags. But it's a way for us to have hundreds of tags depending on the types of objects, because maybe SQL servers need different tagging than maybe a virtual machine. So you can have hundreds of tags, but any one object can only have 50 tags. An object can only have one tag of one name value pair you're dealing with. And it's a great way, as I said, to be able to sort from a billing construct. We often talk it that way, but I use it quite extensively for the applying of policies, which we're going to cover in a later module. So I say if it's tagged for a specific reason, you'll show you a feature called resource locking. If you have a resource that needs to be locked, what often happens is people unlock it, do something to it, and they forget to lock it again. So I run a regular report to say, find objects that are tagged as locked that are not locked. And it identifies them, and I can reapply the locks for them. So there's lots of reasons to tag objects, and I would encourage you to think about them as a great way to eventually grow your business to potentially having thousands or hundreds of thousands of resources to be able to identify those objects for a variety of billing and automation purposes. We're going to be focusing specifically on Azure governance, and we're going to be looking at the specific area of designing for Azure policies. Let's get into it. We've talked about governance across a number of modules, and we've seen that governance is a business's ability to apply a set of rules to create a desired outcome. And these rules are usually fairly well defined. We have the capability within Azure to define those rules in this thing called a policy. A policy is a definition. It's referred to as a JSON document where you can define what that rule is and what you want to have happen if that object that it applies to either is compliant or non-compliant to the rule. Azure policies are very granular. They typically deal with one object and one outcome. We have the ability to apply multiple policies to an object. That leaves the job up to you to figure out which policy needs to apply. There's kind of a parent version of this called initiatives. An initiative is a grouping of policies that are deployed as a single group. So policies have a unique characteristic, but I can have multiple policies applied together in this thing called an initiative and apply the initiative. The cool thing about that, for me at least, if a new business rule comes along for an object that has an initiative, all I have to do is add it to the initiative, and it gets added to all the places where that initiative was deployed. So there's some real efficiencies. And I often do this with customers. If they have one policy needed to apply to one object, I still put it into an initiative. It's an extra step, but I've learned over time, what happens is businesses change. And now it's only one policy today, but now they can go to that one initiative, add the new policy, and have it apply in a number of locations. So think of policies and initiatives as kind of a hand-in-hand way to work with this. The policies that are available to you initially, there's a variety of built-in policies and initiatives that are predefined in Azure. You have the capability to create your custom policies and custom initiatives. I'll give you an example. GDPR is a government policy that many companies might have to apply. And it goes across a wide variety of Azure resources to become compliant to that GDPR rule. As opposed to having to apply all the discrete pieces to all the objects that might have to have that applied, I can roll all of those policies into a single GDPR initiative and deploy it to the resources that need it. And that way, if something changes, something gets added to or removed from the GDPR regulations, all I have to do is to change the policy in that initiative and have it apply globally. So take a look at the deployment of policies to be able to create those business rules. On top of that, we can have a whole variety of actions. So what happens is the resources or scope that you've deployed a policy to will require all the objects that the policy applies to become compliant to that policy. We saw that there was this hierarchical structure of management groups down to resource groups. Applying a policy at the top level would apply that policy through that hierarchical chain of management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. So if I have multiple policies applied at multiple levels, there are rules and regulations to determine how they get merged together. If I have two policies at two different levels that don't conflict, they merge together. If I have two policies that try and change the same object, the child object, the one closest to, they take precedence. I can have rules that say audit only, so only report if an object is compliant or not. I can have it say, if not compliant, don't allow it to be deployed. I can say if it's not compliant, bring it into compliance by doing something to it. So we have this whole complex set of rules that if it becomes your job to perform, you could go in and learn how to do that. But from an architectural perspective, policies are the actual enforcement of the business rules that you can write. You deploy them to those scopes that we've covered across a number of other modules. We're looking at Azure governance, and we're going to be focusing in on the topic of RBAC, or role-based access control. Let's get into it. Before I jump into the material, I want to make sure that we understand a couple of the terms that we're going to be referencing here. Over a period of time, you might be used to the old permission model called ACLs and ACEs. Access control lists had access control entries, and then we had permissions. You could have a folder that had files in that folder. The folder would have an access control list. On that access control list, you would have an access control entry that said administrators had full control. So there's an example of an access control list, had an access control entry, a grouping of users or an individual user that has a specific permission. We fundamentally have changed that model for the last couple of years, and this is where RBAC has come in. Role-based access control is predicated on three specific components. And I'm going to draw them as three different bubbles. They are who, what, and where. When we take a look at the who, this becomes a concept called an identity. If you haven't seen the other modules, identities are the modern set of credentials that are available through the identity governance portion of Azure. Users, groups, devices, managed identities, applications. So all of these are the who's. So these are the things that we can assign RBAC to. Users, groups, the what becomes this term called roles. And we're going to be covering this in just a few minutes. Now, roles fall into two major groupings. We have some built-in roles, and we have some custom roles. Well, we don't have them. You can build your own custom roles. So roles become the grouping of permissions. So instead of you have some default roles that we talk about throughout these courses called owner, contributor, reader. There may be a key vault publisher. So there's some very descriptive, very granular levels of permissions that are assigned to specific roles. We then get the where, which becomes this term called scopes. And it's important that in other modules, we spent quite a bit of time talking about what the scope levels are. The scope at the tenant. We scope below what the tenant is the management groups, and there's 10,000 of them up to 7 layers deep. Below the management groups, we get subscriptions as another scope. Below subscriptions, we get resource groups. So we can take a who, we assign, is the word. You assign a who, a what, to a where. And so I can say this group of users has this role to this scope. And by default, those assignments are inherited in all child attributes and branches below the scope in which it's assigned. So when we take a look at RBAC, we're going to get back into the lecture material here. It's a way of controlling access using modern credentials and this modern methodology to be able to granularly control and very discreetly assign permissions and capabilities to a group of users, assign them to a scope, and have that inherited down throughout the entire hierarchy that you're working with. And so you can see all those concepts described for you. When you have roles overlap, permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So if I got a member of the HR users group and they have read permissions, but I'm also an HR manager that has a write permission, my HR manager gave me write, my HR user gave me read, I effectively have the overlapping or the cumulative permissions of all of them. So there's some general rules that follow from the older legacy models. Permissions are cumulative with the exception of a deny. So there is a deny capability that if you have a permission granted to you, but it's denied further down in the hierarchy, your effective permission would be the deny wherever it's applied and then further on down from that scope level. We're going to be looking specifically at Azure architecture, and we're going to focus in on the area of this thing called landing zones. Let's get into it. Landing zones are a set of prescribed templated environments that Microsoft has pre-configured and made available for you to start your architectural journey. It doesn't have to be at the very start. You can actually add these after the fact. So if you've had some time in Azure and you want to start to adopt landing zones, absolutely, you're not going to be precluded from doing that because you've already started. But landing zones are templated environments that we've pre-configured and designed that you can actually have a full set of scripting and language. There's architectural documents that go along with this. So you can go to the Architect Center, find the landing zones, find which one might fit your specific requirements, or heck, even find one or two, and you can customize them to be able to meet your specific needs as a templated starting point. As I said, there's reasoning that goes behind them, there's documentation, there's scripting that comes through to help deploy the actual landing zones and the resources that they need. But it's a great way for you to be able to pre-provision the environments. It's done through code, so it's not a manual process. And you could go in and change them after the fact or even change it in the code before it takes place. It has identity management that comes along with this. It's got networking and resource management. So it's got a whole set of best practice recommendations that come from Microsoft to be able to have this work for you. So now that we've taken a look at the various components of governance, we're now going to break out and we'll do a demonstration. I'll show you most of these within the limited time that we have, but let's get into the demo. Before I actually get into the demo, I just want to give you an overview of what it is I'm going to be doing. Down the left-hand side, you'll see three users, user tenant root, user Contoso, and user Ammer. I've assigned these three users to each of the management group levels. And you'll see, as I go through the management group, you'll see that at the Ammer management group, Ammer user is going to be directly assigned to it, and it will have inherited user Contoso and user tenant root from their parent object. I also want to point out that I get to name but also give an ID number to the management group. I've come up with my own naming convention and a numbering system. So here we are inside the portal. You'll see that I've got the tenant root group. If I select that object, I've got options to rename it if I want, but you'll see that I see its child objects that I have right below it. I'm going to come into the access control or identity access management. Take a look at role assignments. I'll scroll down to the reader role, and you'll see that I've highlighted user tenant root as a reader. I'm going to come down to one of its child management groups, in this case, Contoso. I'm going to go into the access control for Contoso, and scrolling down to its group of readers, you'll notice that I have two. I've got user Contoso that was specifically assigned at this resource level, and I have user tenant root that was inherited from a management group. It doesn't tell me which one, but if I hover over top of it, you'll see it gives me the identity number of the management group. I'm going to keep drilling down, and you can see that I've got 4 management groups below Contoso. I'm going to come into Ammer, take a look at its access control and role assignment. I'll scroll down to the reader group, and it's in here you'll see that I've got all 3 users assigned. I've got user Ammer assigned to this resource, and you'll see user Contoso and user tenant root were inherited from their management group. And if I hover over top of management group, you'll see what is the identity of those management group. This one is 02004. Coming back to the management groups themselves, you'll see those numbers now, which I showed out to you before, 02004. So that's showing you the way that you can nest management groups and have permissions inherited all the way down through. Remember that we've got a tiered parent-child relationship amongst our management group. Off of our tenant root, I've got a group for Contoso, And below Contoso, I've got a set of geographic regions of AMER, APAC, EMEA, and GNA. Within each of these, I've assigned some subscriptions. The AMER management group has an AMER subscription, which has actually been disabled. What I'm going to do is take subscription 1 and move it down into the AMER management group. You'll notice that when I log into the user AMER account, which is associated with the AMER management group, it will not be able to see subscription 2, but it will see the AMER subscription and subscription 1. So I'm logged into the portal, and you can see from the upper right-hand corner that I've logged in with a user account that has the necessary permissions at the tenant root to do what it is that I need to do. I'm in the management group area, and you can see that I've got the subscriptions that I've talked about. I now want to assign the subscription 1 to the AMER management group. So I'm going to come into the AMER management group to do this, and I'm going to add this subscription for subscription 1. So you can see that I've got subscription 1 now added to the AMER group. Come back to the management groups. You should see that reflected in here. I'm now going to log in to another user account that is associated with the AMER management group. I should see these 2 subscriptions, but I will not be able to access subscription number 2 because it's at the same level that I have not got permissions either inherited or specifically assigned to me. So I've logged in with the user account, user AMER, and you'll see that I can take a look at the subscriptions that I have access to. I see subscription 1 and the AMER subscription, the one that I mentioned, has been disabled. Let's go see what happens if I try and create a resource. I'm going to try and create a virtual machine, and you'll see that it gives me access to the subscription 1 and the disabled AMER subscription. I do not see subscription number 2, which was associated with the EMEA management group. You also notice that it says that I do not have the ability to do this because it's not got the resource provider allocated to this subscription. I did talk about this in the lecture. I'm actually going to have to register this resource provider. Now, this user account does not have the permissions to be able to do this, and I'm going to go back to my tenant root management group user account to do this. I've switched back into my admin account. I'm going to come into subscription number 1, and I'm going to scroll down the left-hand side here under settings. I'm going to look at resource providers. Looking for the compute resource provider, you'll see that I have a number of compute resource providers, but specifically the Microsoft Compute is not registered. I can register this so that these resources can be billed against this subscription. You'll now see that this is registered, and I'm going to switch back to the other user account. So I've successfully registered all of the needed resource providers onto the subscription, and I'll come back in. I'm now back at my user AMER user account, and now if I try create a resource, you'll see that I still have access to subscription 1 only, and I'm no longer getting those error messages. To complete this demonstration, I'm going to log in as another user account, in this case, my user EMEA account, and I'll take a look at its access to a subscription, which should only be subscription number 2. So clicking on virtual machines, you can see that it only gives me access to subscription number 2, and I'm getting the same resource provider requirement. So I would have to go in, register those resource providers to be billed against that subscription, and then this user would be able to use that subscription to create resources. So we've demonstrated the inherited permissions as well as subscription structure. We've also taken a look at registering resource providers so that resources can be billed against it. I've got a demonstration that I want to talk about the best practices for deploying the resource groups themselves. Within the hierarchy, we see that management groups flow down to subscriptions, flow down to resource groups. And then what I have is 2 examples here. On the left-hand side, we have resources going to be grouped by the type of resources. This may be something that you've typically done in the past. The networking team would manage all the networking resources. The SQL team would manage all the SQL servers. The virtual machine team would manage all the virtual machines. And so I've grouped them specifically that way, regardless of what region that they're in. The Microsoft recommended pattern is to group things by lifecycle. You want to put things that share a common lifecycle from creation through to use, through to update, all the way through to destruction. It is recommended that you put them into the same resource group. Now, those are the 2 extremes, and you have hybrids that are combinations of them. We're not going to go into all of them right now, but just know that the recommended standard is to try and group things by a common lifecycle. When it comes to tagging, it's important to know that any one object can have up to 50 tags on it. When we take a look at a tag, and I'll be doing a demonstration of that in just a minute, they are referred to as name-value pairs. So a tag for things like cost center could have multiple values, 11011, 11012, whatever your cost center numbers might be. But any one object can only have one cost center. You can't have two cost centers of the same name with different values. You can only have one name value pair. Now you can have up to 50 attributes. So you can have cost center, one value. You could have environment, one value. And you could have 48 other names with one value in it, but they just can't be duplicates. Can't have two cost centers, can't have two environments, and so on. But the list of overall name value pair tags that you can have in your entire organization is virtually unlimited, but any one object can only have 50 of them at any given time. Let's go and take a look at this. I'm going to use the RG_AZ-305 demo resource group that I've already created. You'll see that I've got some resources already applied to it, and I'm going to go in and create a tag at the resource group level, and then we'll go into the objects inside and see what happened. I'm going to start with creating that cost center resource group. Typing one in allows me to create it, so you want to follow a naming standard, and I'll give you a demonstration of why that's going to be important in just a second. I've created the tag called cost center, and I can give it one of the numbers that I've used in my explanation, 11011. I will not be able to add another cost center tag to this using the same name. As soon as I give it the same name, you come up with the error that it says that name is already in use, you can only use it once. Well, not exactly what it says, but you can only use it once. So let me get rid of this. I'm going to create one for environment, and I'll use this for dev. I've created my two tags. Now, why it's so important that you follow a naming convention is what happens if I call one Enviro. It will actually let me create a tag for that. And is Enviro the same as environment? Is cost center as one word the same as cost center with two words? Got to be very careful that people are just not randomly making up names or mistyping them, thereby spelling them incorrectly. I've got two tags associated with the resource group, and I can do all sorts of things with those tags. I can filter, I can search on them, I can apply policies to them. But let's go to the resources inside of the resource group and see what happens to them. We saw previously that they inherited things like permissions and policies to the individual objects. I'm going to come down to a resource here. I'll look at its tags, and you'll see it has no tags. So there is no relationship between a parent-child for the tagging. If you want tags to be automatically applied to a resource, you would create a tagging policy that would either require or automatically apply a tag to an object. Once you're in the portal and taking a look at the policy, there's a great amount of information that you can get about the policies that are deployed, the level of compliance or not compliance. All of this information is also available in many other formats that we're not going to cover in this lesson. We're going to take a look at the policy definition and their assignments. When you take a look at a policy, there is a JSON document that defines what is being controlled. Now, there's several different things we want to look at as we go through the portal. There are policies that are either custom or built in, and there's a thing called an initiative, which are also custom or built in. A policy has one governance component that it manages. When you take a look at multiple policies that you may want to apply to something, for example, in the United States, they have a thing called the HIPAA regulations for health information. In Europe, they have the GDPR rules for general data protection. There's not just one thing that you're controlling. There's many things that are being controlled in both of those scenarios. So each policy controlling one attribute of either HIPAA or GDPR would then be combined together in this thing called an initiative. And then that way you can apply all of the policies at once through the initiative. And we'll go through and do a demonstration of assigning to a scope level. We saw that that scope level is from the management group down to the subscriptions, through the subscriptions into the resource groups. And policies are inherited from a parent-child relationship. So if you assign a policy up at the management group level, all the sub-management groups and subscriptions and resource groups that fall in that hierarchical chain would therefore inherit the policies applied at the parent object. In the Azure portal and on the policy blade, you'll see that under definitions, I've got a whole set of initiatives and policies. Policies are granular. If I click on it, you'll see the JSON document that defines it, that talk about all the characteristics that are going to be controlled by this policy. If I go into an initiative, you will see the one or more policies policies that are applied in this initiative. In this one, you can see that we have 36 different built-in policies that are applied through the initiative. Once you have a policy or an initiative defined, you then assign it to a scope. So I'm going to assign a policy, but you can do an initiative. You define which scope do you want to assign it to, and we've talked about the management groups in a parent-to-child relationship. I can assign it at the tenant root, which would be inherited all the way down. I can go to the Contoso management group, which would then be inherited by its child management groups. And within these child management groups off of the tenant root, we then can apply which subscription. So if I wanted to, if you remember in a previous lesson, we talked about main was assigned at the tenant root, but subscription 1 was applied to AMR. And so if I apply it to the subscription level, it would start from there and be inherited down. Or it can be assigned to the actual resource group. Okay, so I'm going to assign it to the subscription. You can have exclusions that would be passed over, and then you select the definition that you want to apply. It is strongly recommended that when you create a new policy, that while you may want to enable it, you may want to enable it for audit only. So that way it will not potentially negatively impact the resources that are being controlled by the policy. The Azure documentation does a great job talking about the effects that a policy can have. If you do a search for understanding Azure policy effects, you'll see that you can add to network group, append, audit, deny. And this is what I was talking about. You do not want to enforce and deny somebody from doing something before they have a chance to make the resources come into compliance. So there's a wide variety of impacts that you can have for the deployment. They talk about the order of operations. There's more reading to do on policies, but hopefully I've shown you what a policy is, what an initiative is, and then how to assign that to a scope. And remember that policies are inherited from parent objects. Let's go back to the lesson. Welcome back from the demo. Now that we've completed this lesson, we saw in that demonstration a number of the technologies that we've discussed in the lessons themselves. We saw the various scopes, starting with the tenant root management group. We nested a series of management groups inside of that. We then used a number of subscription that we allocated. And one of the big key takeaways is child objects inherits things from their parent object. So from a parent-to-child relationship of a manager group or even a subscription within it, we inherit certain things from the parent object that controls us. Now, what we saw then was we had RBAC, or the role-based access control, that what we said at the tenant root management group, we saw that that inherited all the way through to the resources in a resource group. We then allocated permissions at different levels of the scope. We went then to a child management group, we went to subscriptions in the resource group, and we saw how those permissions were inherited. We then went in and did a demonstration on policies and how it enforced the use of a specific type of virtual machine scale or size that we had available to us. And then we took a look at some of the other capabilities in this governance model. So a great place to start your architectural solution. This is going to be the foundation to make sure that you build and design in a secure model. And that goes into that first lesson that we talked about, was secure by default. So thanks very much. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.